Good evening. The poet Charles Bukowski once wrote, "We're all going to die, all of us. What a circus." That alone should make us love each other, but it doesn't. We are terrorized and flattened by trivialities. We are eaten up by nothing. This evening, I want to speak about one of the core existential givens of being human: death. As the present moment fades into the abyss of timeless past, sometimes a human being can feel themselves in the memory of what is happening right now. To be in the moment and to feel that moment passing. To feel that it will be a moment that one looks back on in the future. That it is a door, ever closing, ever opening, always making room for more whilst always closing out more. There is one foot in, one foot out. Every single moment, no matter how enjoyable or painful, passes. It is an incessant passing, and amongst all this are we. We are creatures who spend our time with others, each of us finite, each of us slowly disappearing. We are decaying creatures who grow and breathe and create and express, living infinitude. A creature that is aware that it will end and that death looms on the horizon, whilst at the same time living and loving and carrying on. A creature capable of truly deep joy, of deep connection. But to feel a deep connection is to feel the pain of its absence. Ernest Becker wrote about this in his book, The Denial of Death. He stated, "We can think of this existential paradox as the strange condition of being a unique individual, yet limited by life's boundaries. Humans have a sense of who they are, a personal identity that sets them apart from the rest of nature. We have names, stories, and the ability to imagine things far beyond ourselves, like tiny atoms of the vastness of the universe. We can even picture ourselves floating somewhere in space looking back at the Earth. This incredible ability almost makes us feel godlike, as some thinkers from the Renaissance believed. But at the same time, as wise teachers from the East have reminded us, we are still very much a part of nature. We are mortal beings made of the same physical stuff as everything else. We are food for worms that eventually return to the earth. This is the paradox. We are both extraordinary and ordinary. We can dream and think beyond the stars, but we're also housed in a fragile, breathing body that evolved from ancient, decayed creatures." Now, that's a paraphrase of what Becker spoke about, and I think that this existential paradox and the given of grappling with this brute fact of our impermanence can be traced to the earliest thinkers and the earliest humans. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the earliest recorded written myths that we have, the main character Gilgamesh laments the death of his best friend Enkidu, and he asks, "When I die, shall I not be like Enkidu? Sorrow enters my heart, I am afraid of death." So what I would like to do in this video is to speak about impermanence and death, and how I think the key task of life is to live with the unavoidable grief that comes with this awareness. So much literature speaks about death anxiety, the fear of death and what it entails, the fear of non-existence, of loss, of regret. But fear can only last so long. There is a difference between knowing death is coming and truly feeling that it is coming. But like all feelings, it passes. Understanding that death happens to all, that it is inevitable, that anxiety is just a feeling, that life can still be well lived in the face of death, these strategies seem to quell death anxiety according to the thinkers of the present and the past. Owen Yalom, a psychiatrist, speaks about awakening experiences causing us to become aware of our deaths in his book Staring at the Sun, stating that we can use these experiences to live more well, and so to fear death less through connection and through the rippling effects that we have on other people. Now, further in the past, the ancient Stoics used to use logic to talk about how death is nothing at all, that there is nothing to be scared of because you won't be there when it happens. The existentialists from the 80s and 90s tell us to live fully to create our own meanings. Religions from times gone by tell us that death isn't the end. And Ernest Becker, a modern psychoanalyst, tells us that death anxiety is the core driver for all human behavior. Modern psychology developed this into terror management theory, which specifically addresses how our fear of death influences our decision making. Then, modern therapists such as Ross and Rachel Menzies specifically look into how death anxiety is an underlying precursor for the development of many conditions. There's a lot here about anxiety and about managing anxiety, and I think that anxiety is somewhat interesting to manage because it's not only a cognitive exercise but also a physical one, which involves slowing down one's body, allowing it to be present, exposing oneself to a fear, and giving oneself more balanced thoughts. The evidence says that these can sometimes help in managing death anxiety. One can begin to change their life in a way where they live more fully, love more fully, appreciate what they have, making the fear of death smaller in theory. Now, in saying that, I think all of these are missing a deeper point and haven't dug deep enough. No matter what we do with our anxiety, no matter how much we change our everyday lives, no matter how present we are and how full and affirmed our everyday existence is, we will always be left with something deeper, a worm at the core of our hearts that cannot be touched by exposure, by thinking, by feeling, by logic. And this is grief. In grief work, it is said that grief is the emotional response to the loss of something that is loved. That mourning is the way that we show grief in public, and bereavement is the period of sadness after the death. So during the period of bereavement is when grief, the emotion, and mourning, the expression of that emotion, occur. Now, when I think about grief and attachment, I imagine it in a way where there are strings tied to every person, connecting them to the people and things that they care about. When these connections are at their fullest, these strings are tight and full of life, reverberating with a bidirectional twang of presence and connection. And when that thing or that person goes, when they disappear, the string goes limp, and there is nothing to give to or receive from, just emptiness. The string is still there, but it has nothing to connect to anymore, nothing tangible, a tether with nothing to hold on to. Sometimes it feels like even the tether disappears completely. The more strings we have, the more emptiness we feel when they are loose. And as we lose these connections, our weight of being, our own weight, becomes heavier because it isn't offset anywhere else. It isn't shared anywhere else. And then when we pass, that core of connection, the beating heart at the center of these strings of your story, of my story, it falls limp, and we are left with a puddle of what once was and never will be again. We are creatures who, in theory, seek attachment, coherence, stability, growth, and impermanence spells the end of all these things. This is a reality that all people experience, but not all people face it under the same circumstances, and some seek to avoid it as much as possible. Existentially, to grieve is to be aware that impermanence and change is the ultimate disconnect from all that we care about and live for as creatures who thrive on connection. People have many different conceptualizations of and relationships to death. To many, it is a tragedy, especially tragic when life has been cut short or one has decided to take themselves out of existence because they've been so let down by the world. There is something so deeply jarring and hurtful about these relationships to death. To others, though, death is a pathway to something beyond. It's a release and a return, leaving them with a feeling of peace. To some, when a life has been well lived, death is the final full stop on what has been a well-written story, the turning of a final page that requires a conclusion in order to be well-written and beautiful. These are different thoughts about death which influence the way the grief impacts us. But regardless of one's perception of it, Impermanence is a brute fact of life that we face in every single moment. The fact is separate from the interpretation. Life is finite and ending. Who you are in this moment lasts barely a moment, and upon realizing this, that moment of you realizing it is already gone into the infinite past. Who you were 5 minutes ago is gone. There is a version of you in the future that will be closed off forever from the version of you in the present. This is true for you and everybody, and the way you interact with those you care about, that is also unrepeatable. Theory says that most of the world is built to avoid our awareness of this. Ernest Becker talks about immortality projects, ways that we manage our terror by appealing to vanity, superficialness, empty, meaningless jobs and lives that are so distracted by nonsense that we never really see what is with us in every single moment. It is only in brief, raw experiences when we face our awareness of mortality, when someone or something we care about departs the world of the living, that we are face to face with this existential fact of our lives and the lives of everyone we care about. Most research has been about death anxiety, about avoiding death, avoiding thinking about death, but I think it goes deeper. It isn't about death causing fear, it is about impermanence causing grief, which we are justifiably trying to avoid, and it is that we are scared of. It is said that what we struggle with are not things in themselves, but our interpretations of these things. And I find that anxiety might not always be related directly to death, but our interpretation of it. And I think the most basic interpretation is as something that renders everything impermanent and fleeting. And the natural response to this realization, I believe, is grief at the going away of everything. I believe the anxiety is trying to prevent us, not from death, but from grief. The honest interpretation, in my opinion, is recognizing this brute fact of impermanence as it is, which is very difficult to swallow. This is what we are truly trying to avoid in a lot of what we do, avoiding the uncomfortable feeling of grief. One of the things that isn't often spoken about is that grief doesn't only occur as a response to loss, it can also occur when one is aware that a loss is on the way, and one can feel the future absence of what it is that they care about. This is called anticipatory grief. Rather than grieving the loss after it occurs, because whatever that thing is still with you, you may feel grief for the things you won't get to do together in the future or that you won't get to experience again. I believe that this is a concept that captures largely what we experience as humans, because loss isn't a one-off event that only happens when we lose the people that we care about. It is constantly happening. All life is a constant flux of loss and new experiences, loss of old experiences, experiences of new experiences. The old makes way for the new and the present, and I think it is completely justifiable for an individual to grieve what they haven't lost, because they actually have lost it, and they will in the future. It is always going, and the knowledge that it is going and will go is itself worthy of grief. Grief isn't just a single response to a single event, it's an ongoing awareness of the transience of everything. Anticipatory grief, to me, appears to capture most of the core human response to the impermanence of life. And why do we even experience this grief? Well, as creatures who can reflect on our situation and our existence, that we aren't just completely present, but we're aware of our presence, we can also reflect on our impermanence. To be aware of life is to be aware of death, and this appears to be one of the core realizations that we can have as humans, that we and everything else is finite. We are confronted with death and loss in every moment, no matter how much the world tries to avoid this. And in saying this, I find that once a loss has occurred, remembering that loss will always bring about some form of the same grief. It is completely unavoidable if one is to be a true, loving human being. And if one knows the pain of grief and one can anticipate that they will lose all they love one day, anticipatory grief appears to be a state that most humans would be in, whether they know it or not. I believe that in the absence of ultimate truth, all spiritualities, philosophies, religions can be viewed through a psychological lens as being approaches to understanding our human nature. They are projections of our internal worlds trying to capture what is external, or projections trying to capture what is within us. Sometimes these views and these approaches are fearful of death and seek to avoid it completely by positing something that comes after death. Sometimes philosophies seek to assist people in using logic to think themselves out of fearing death and allowing the knowledge of impermanence to guide a better life. It doesn't take that much digging into different ways of approaching life to see that they are largely concerned with managing impermanence. Not completely, but enough to make me notice that it is a core theme in most bodies of work that seriously approach life and human knowledge. Any genuine quest to understand oneself and the world will always involve an awareness of mortality. Many approaches to capturing and guiding our lives seek to answer similar kinds of questions, such as what does it mean to die and what does it mean to live well? And through all different theories, approaches, beliefs, truths, the only truly justifiable and objective knowledge we are left with is the brute fact of our physical demise. No matter what comes after that, me in the way I know me will no longer exist. I don't think this applies to every single philosophical and psychological approach, but I don't think that any genuine theory or approach to understanding and guiding humans can ignore our impermanence or how to manage it. Most approaches are about how to understand ourselves better and how to live better, through ways of conceptualizing our relationship with our thoughts, feelings, behavior, our self-impermanence, changing the way we see it, changing the way we live, and hearing other stories about it. I noticed that an initial foray into understanding death and looking into this bears anxiety and nihilism, like Ecclesiastes in the Bible, who talks about how all is dust, that all is coming to an end, so everything is pointless. What are we doing any of this for? We are creatures that survive by engaging in goal-directed behavior, but there is no truly objective, ultimate goal that we can strive for. We are creatures seeking something that we can't find. The universe offers us no voice, no words or meaning. We are here in mystery. We have built up our civilizations on sand, and once we notice there is no solid ground, we can feel how shaky everything is. Once we acknowledge this existential given and feel the anxiety, one path is to take a leap of faith. This involves believing in something one can't objectively justify because it alleviates their fear. Most religions and spiritualities involve leaps of faith. However, if one continues down the existential or psychological route and avoids any leaps, what comes next is facing the fact of impermanence and living alongside this without shying away from it. And as I say this, I also want to acknowledge that pretty much all psychological and existential theories also involve unjustifiable leaps of faith, but they may just be incrementally more justifiable than what religion and spiritualities do. So, in facing the fact of our impermanence, this could result in immense despair and a focus on how everything will go away. Or it can result in an immense appreciation of life, an awakening experience that allows one to connect more with the people around them, with themselves, with the world in light of their finitude. There's an infinite amount of responses to the fact of our impermanence and deaths. None of these are right or wrong, correct or incorrect. Many of these are dishonest, and as someone who values honesty as an important part of a full and genuine life, these interpretations don't speak to me. However, it is worth saying that some of these are helpful in accepting it, some of these are unhelpful. A mix of these responses is most normal in anybody, and hopefully when one faces their impermanence, one is able to be aware that how they face it is partly up to them and their interpretation of it, but also it is largely up to what they have been taught to believe about it. There's only so much an individual mind can do after it has been conditioned for so many years. But no matter what one believes or thinks about it, it arrives all the same. And the paradox of all of these theories and approaches is that the more one faces death and learns to love life, to appreciate what is around them, to connect more deeply with those around them, to treasure and cherish every moment in this rare experience of existence, the depth of the grief one will experience at the loss of all this is just as grand. As one's capacity to love grows, one's depth of grief increases. The more one is to encourage their life to be one of love, the more they are encouraging grief to be a part of their life. And I suspect that no matter how accepting an individual is of death, it would always leave some kind of gap in their being. Grief arrives all the same, and I don't think it ever fully goes away. None of the theories in psychology or philosophy, spirituality or religion can accurately capture this feeling of grief because they all seek to avoid it in some way. They all seek to avoid the pain of the uncomfortable emotion by positing some kind of interpretation about it, which they say is true. Even this ultimate theory in psychology of death anxiety and saying that all of these things are happening because people are afraid of their deaths and want to avoid the awareness of that. This theory could itself, in a way, be shying away from the reality of death. Because by intellectualizing it as anxiety, which is an emotion that is theoretically manageable through a number of psychological techniques, they limit the intensity of it. And then by connecting the brute fact of our non-existence, of our deaths with anxiety, they are saying that we can manage our fears of death. But they've sidestepped the brute fact that we need to live with the awareness that there is death at all. Not that it is scary, but that it is there. That there is impermanence, and that beyond the anxiety, I believe, is grief, sadness, loss, and emptiness. That is what the anxiety is trying to prevent. Because all we can fear is our interpretation of things. That is separate from the things themselves. Now, even with anxiety, when it comes to managing it, it's impossible to know if any of the techniques work 100% of the time, but with grief, it isn't so theoretically easy to capture and manage. When facing it in the most honest way, grief and loss are intertwined emotions, and they are really difficult to manage, and it'll be really sad. The more you care for something, the more of a hole there will be in your life when it is gone. And all you care for will be gone. So all of us and you can and will be empty one day. No matter what you believe, the end will come. And in my experience, the feeling associated with this isn't anxiety. It has been. But deeply encompassing that is grief. We can accept there is an end and that life is finite. We can accept this instead of being shut down by fear, which will still always be there somewhat by virtue of being human. But I think that we will always struggle to accept that it has to happen at all, that this is the nature of things. That we have an opportunity to love deeply, but only if we accept that the depth of sadness that follows is inevitable, and that all interactions will fade into the past. All the people we love today, interact with today, in 150 years they will all be dust, and a whole new group of humans will exist, and we are all going to be forgotten. And then they will go too, and then my name will be spoken for the last time one day not too far away. My lineage will die out, my work and words will be lost in the sands of time. And I imagine my memories are kind of like the rooms in a hotel where I only really have access to one room, the room of the present moment. And all of my memories are rooms that I can peer into through the peepholes on the doors, but I can never fully experience them again. I can only blurrily imagine them. And even then, the room that I am in is one that I am being dragged out of and into the next every single sliver of unforgiving time. All I can be in is now, which is the forever dynamic flowing and changing of what is happening. The paradox that no one has been able to answer is what to do with our grief, because when death has been faced head on, which is what all great psychologies and philosophies do, even if it has been fully integrated and accepted into one's being, the pain of grief will be just as deep, and we are left with the emptiness of loss. This is the experience of being human. It is only natural that the more one loves things, the more one will grieve. I fear the loss of what I care about, but I fear that loss because I know grief is guaranteed and I want to avoid that deeply painful emotion. Nostalgia pangs me, it hurts, those moments gone forever. Looking through the peepholes in the hotel room of memories in my mind is suffused with both beauty, gratitude, and a deep gnawing pain. So the entire corpus of philosophy, psychology, spirituality, religion, I believe, is largely seeking to answer the question, how do I live? But not only that, it is how do I live knowing that I'm impermanent? And each of these approaches provide their own medicines, their own stories and answers, and each of these seek to alleviate the fear associated with loss, but don't do much with the grief. They haven't gone deep enough. In the search for truth and for answers, I can accept no less than what is truly honest and believable. What is this? That there is no ultimate answer to redeem us, that grief and death are inescapable, and that what you do with that information is partly up to you and partly up to what you've been taught throughout your life. So what to do with grief? What is my say as a psychologist? Well, grief is a feeling, and there are better and worse ways to manage feelings if one has the goal of seeking growth, feeling, let emotions be felt, letting them be processed rather than avoiding them and causing more suffering. In all honesty, the literature on existential grief is minimal to none. However, there is lots of literature on managing grief generally. Nothing too tangible though. Something that resonates the most with existential grief, I believe, is the dual process model of grieving. This is an oscillating set of poles one bounces between in everyday life. On one side, one may be focused on the loss and the pain of what is no longer there, the missing, the nostalgia, the sadness and emptiness. Alternatively, on the other pole, one may be focused on restoration. This is about figuring out one's role in life, knowing the loss has occurred or will occur, creating new traditions, forming new relationships, adjusting one's roles in life. It also involves making space for grief and expressing it openly. But in this model, no matter what one does, whether it is loss-oriented or restoration-oriented, it is still all occurring in the shadow of grief and managing that feeling. My own solution is to sit with this feeling, to express it, to allow life to be influenced by this, and to accept that the feeling isn't going to completely go away. Feelings can't be controlled. They can be managed, and we can choose to ride the waves of these feelings in a healthy way by allowing them to process. But I suspect that a great awareness of grief will result in a cascade of emotions that will never fully be accessible or processable. All we can do to avoid needless suffering is to ride the waves of grief as they come. If we are ignorant, if we seek to avoid it, our lives will be full of compulsive strategies which we are already seeing in our modern world, which limit our existence and our capacity to live and love. I believe that the only honest way to manage it is to acknowledge it and to allow life to be affected by it, to integrate it into our being, to face the tragedy, and then to also be aware that everything has an opposite, and that the flip side of the pain of grief is the depth of the awe and love that can be experienced in life. And a consequence of this depth of awe and love is the urgency, the thumos, to drive and participate and expand and create. This is also an outcome of this tragic awareness. In saying this, I believe that there is a third part to the dual process model, making it a three-part model that captures what it means to be human in a limited way. Or it captures what I think it means to be human. Firstly, there is tragic awareness, the awareness of our finitude, contemplating all we will lose and have lost, and the grief that accompanies it. On the opposite side completely is the potential zest for life that this can encourage, a seizing of the day and awareness of finitude, leading to a grasping for what is here and now, maximizing this brief fight before the dying of the light. And finally, the middle ground is presence, a detachment from thoughts and feelings, noticing that they are within us but not us, focusing on what is around us in the moment and being there without the stickiness of our awareness that all things is fading. Between tragic awareness and drive is this moment. And in this moment there is no death, no further judgment, only awareness of the senses, of what is here and now. In this present moment, the awareness of death dissipates for a moment. And I love this respite, but I also love the tragic awareness, as the love creates more grief, which creates more love, which creates more grief, which creates more room to love ad infinitum. So I'd like to talk a bit more about this trinity of existential grief. So this model I'm talking about, I picture it as a triangle that we are thrown into and have to manage. There is a triangle and we rotate around it like we're in a washing machine. Human beings, in confronting the inevitable reality of impermanence, seem to oscillate naturally between three broad modes of experience and response, like I just mentioned. And these are not rigid stages or exclusive categories, but rather dynamic poles, fluid ways of being that we move through repeatedly across our lives, often simultaneously. And I believe that this trinity of existential grief is a useful conceptual map to better understand our existential navigation through grief, life, and presence. So the first pole, the first corner of this triangle is tragic awareness. And at this pole, we confront the raw, unmediated awareness of impermanence, the finite nature of life, the certainty of loss, the weight of grief, and the emptiness that inevitably follows attachment's rupture. This is the domain of existential despair and mourning, where the horror of nothingness threatens to engulf the self. Now, philosophically, people like Ernest Becker and the terror management theory articulate how the awareness of death and its related anxiety is foundational to the human condition, fueling much of our behavior. Existentialists like Kierkegaard and Sartre explore despair as the confrontation with absurdity and finitude, and Heidegger has this concept of being toward death, which emphasizes the necessity of facing finitude to live authentically. But this can be deeply unsettling. Now, I think this pole is important to acknowledge because it refuses to deny the inescapable truth of loss and grief. It is like the shadow side of our human experience. Now, the opposite side of the triangle, the other corner, is the thumos, or the vital drive. Because from a tragic awareness arises a powerful countervailing force. The equal and opposite reaction of the tragedy is the urgent and creative life-affirming drive. This is the pole of vitality, passion, and existential defiance. It is the surge of thumos, which is the spirited energy to create, to love, to rebel, and to say yes to life despite its impermanence. Now, thinkers who have come up with similar concepts are like Nietzsche, who spoke about his affirmation of life, his love of fate in Amor Fati, where he urges the embracing of all aspects of experience. Albert Camus, in works like The Myth of Sisyphus, exclaims that humans should live to the point of tears, embracing the absurd without resignation. The Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, teach us to live in accordance with nature, accepting what we can't change and focusing on virtue in action. And Viktor Frankl, in his logotherapy, emphasizes the will to meaning, a purposeful engagement with life even in the face of suffering. Now, this second pole gives us a framework with which to respond to our finitude with courage and creation and meaning. And finally, the tip of the triangle between the extremes of tragic awareness and vital drive lies the calm, centering space, which is the pole of presence. Here, the oscillations of grief and passion soften into a direct, unmediated awareness of the present moment, neither grasping nor rejecting, just being. It is a space where the weight of loss and the surge of life temporarily dissolves, allowing for stillness and peace. Now, this is a bit more like the spiritual and mystical traditions. In Buddhism and Zen, they have practices of mindfulness and mu, which means emptiness or no thingness, where they encourage presence as a way to transcend suffering and attachment. In Hinduism, they have the concept of Lila, the cosmic play, which invites us to see life as a spontaneous and ever-changing thing, a dance to be witnessed rather than resisted. In Christian mysticism, they speak of kenosis, which is the emptying of self or surrender that allows union with the present. And modern mindfulness-based therapies embody this pole by cultivating non-judgmental awareness of thoughts and feelings. Now, I believe that the honest view is one that integrates all of these as interconnected parts of our human experience. Interestingly, this process also seems to largely involve our attention. What we pay attention to is what guides our lives. No matter what is happening within us, we always have some freedom to choose what to pay attention to and to choose whether we want to ride the wave of what our body is giving us. Sometimes putting our focus on something other than what we're feeling can be a helpful distraction. Other times it can be a willfully ignorant maneuver which makes suffering more likely. It is worth saying that none of these responses are better or worse than any other. They are all key parts of being human, and I think the best any of us can do is to be aware of these, and to just be aware that there are ways to inch towards or out of any of these stages, and that they are all normal parts of being human. None of them should be avoided. They should all be acknowledged as a part of our experience, because focusing on loss and focusing on emptiness also shows us how much room there is for more and the depth of what we experienced. And then being present gives us a respite from both of these. However, we cannot completely exist in presence because life must be lived and we must think, and in a way I find it so stunningly tragic and beautiful that we can even experience this depth of feelings and this confusion. The pain is almost unbearable, meaning that the joy itself was likely as unbearable too. Love creates grief, and awareness of grief can create love, and vice versa into eternity. The human experience of impermanence is complex, non-linear, and deeply paradoxical. And for me, this trinity of grieving appears to be the most honest framework that I can capture for what it means to be a human in the Western world, or more honestly, what it means to be me. I don't think that it is ultimate. It fits my experience in a limited way, and it may fit yours, and if it does, I'm very glad. And if not, I hope that you can find what works for you. This is my way of seeing it. It's one perspective born from my lived experience, study, and reflection. Life, in an ultimate sense, is not a theory to be discovered or a puzzle to be solved. It is something to be lived in all its contradiction and mystery. And so the poles that I describe are not truths, but tools to help us name and navigate what we feel and to navigate what I feel. And if I didn't come up with it, if someone else came up with exactly what I'm talking about, I'd probably find some good reasons to disagree with it. But life is easier with some framework. So this has been my attempt at capturing some of it. So, to conclude, we are humans. Creatures who can reflect on their situation and can understand that they will die. Creatures who feel deeply, who seek stability and coherence and connection. And a lot of what we do seems at a deeper level to be about avoiding impermanence, avoiding awareness of impermanence, and avoiding the grief that comes with it. So, to conclude, how to reconcile this? What to do about this, I don't know. There is no correct answer. Impermanence arrives all the same. The person I was at the beginning of this video is no longer who I am now. These words will trickle away into nothingness, like all that came before and all that will come after. Nevertheless, life must continue to be lived in the face of this looming presence of loss. Life goes on, and one can choose how they want to go about managing their relationship with grief if they choose to do so. Choosing to avoid it completely and to live a life where one doesn't pay attention to it is not much worse than facing it, because ultimately it matters very little. Though what I say comes from a background of psychology and my own experience and expertise, at the end of the day, all psychological theories, I believe, largely express the beliefs and feelings of their founding fathers and mothers. And what we have gotten here today is my own cherry-picked account of what matters to me. And in some ways, I feel like I've said nothing at all. That I'm a dog chasing its own tail, running in circles, feeling like something is happening, but in reality, nothing is achieved. Because the grief remains and I have no ultimate answer for this. Now for me, when I don't think too much about it, when I don't intellectualize it too much, when I don't focus on the feeling too much with my attention, when I allow my awareness to be and to notice these things within me non-judgmentally, I notice also that accompanying the grief is a strange sense of beauty in this tragic awareness. There is a poignancy. Now, I don't know if there's a word that completely captures this, but it is a felt sense of unbearable sadness, tragedy, and appreciation and gratitude as opposite poles of what it means to love and to attach and to exist and to lose. And that this is the depth of what I as a person can experience. And relationally, this breeds an infinite compassion for others. And to see people as they are in everyday life, knowing that they are here for a split second and gone the next, and that in 100 years that their name will not be spoken again, but in this moment, here now, we are together. Now, it's easy to get lost in this. What am I even saying? The behind death anxiety and most anxiety is grief. The grief of impermanence and the loss of everything. We have done so much to avoid this grief and this anxiety, and this has created very unhealthy lives for the people in our modern world. This doesn't mean all is bad or that life is tragic. It doesn't mean life is a wonderful, rare chance at existence. We don't need these interpretations prior to acknowledging that impermanence is an observable feature of our existence. And that we as humans function by fighting against impermanence through attachment, seeking coherence and stability. We are creatures that have developed to love things that we must lose. And I believe the most honest thing to do is to acknowledge that there's no escape, to face this impermanence and to let it guide one's life, bouncing between the three poles of grieving. We will always live our lives in the shadow of grief. However, if one doesn't value honesty or truth-seeking as a core of their being, then there's nothing wrong with living life in a completely different way. In saying all this, I believe that if we face our grief, the only way to handle it honestly is to sit with it, to express it, to create about it, to live with it, to share about it, and that is all. There's no guidebook, there's no answer, there's no solution. The grief will be there, the sadness will come. And hopefully we can channel this into allowing us to live and love more fully as we slowly get closer to being nothing, because that is all we can really do with it. The grief will ultimately always hurt, and being human will hurt. But if we are completely honest, the only reason it can hurt so much is if we care so much and had the opportunity to love so much. And I do want to acknowledge that I'm not saying that grief is the fundamental emotion behind everything and that everything comes down to death and impermanence. I'm just saying that it is largely an unavoidable part of life, and for me, and maybe some others, that the awareness of this fact causes a large stir of emotions that are difficult to manage and that feel primary to my experience of being human. For many humans, myself included, a core emotional response to impermanence is grief. Others may feel anxiety, awe, or acceptance. My framework prioritizes grief not as a universal truth, but as an honest description of one common human orientation. And that is what this video was about. Grief is one culturally mediated response to the fact of impermanence, and it seems to be a Western one at that, and one that may not always exist. But because I know that there is no objective truth in the matter, what I'm interested in is the way I and others feel about the matter and how the people around me feel. And this feeling is that the more deeply I love, the more deeply I grieve, and that the more deeply I grieve, the more deeply I know that I have loved. And perhaps it is only because love and grief are in such intimate relationships and intertwinements that being human is what it is. Now, I want to finish with some apt quote about life, grief, and death, but nothing captures it. The depth of it is beyond what our language can give us.